Did you know that during World War II, the United States built more than 300,000 aircraft? Or that American farmers produced record harvests year after year, feeding not just a nation but its allies too? We often think of the war in terms of battles and generals. We see images of soldiers on foreign shores. But there was another war, a war fought in factories, in kitchens, in backyards, and in classrooms. It was a war of production, of sacrifice, and of profound social change. How does a country transform itself almost overnight from a nation at peace to the engine of a global conflict? What does it look like when every single citizen, in ways big and small, is mobilized for a single purpose? The stories are not always in the history books. They are in the quiet moments, the everyday struggles, and the faded photographs that capture a world turned upside down. Number 21. How do you turn a car factory into an arsenal? Look at the photograph. The sheer scale is hard to grasp. A factory floor stretches into the distance, so vast it seems to have its own horizon. Men and women, tiny figures in this cathedral of industry, swarm over the skeleton of an airplane. Not a small plane, but a heavy bomber, a B-24 Liberator. Its metal skin gleams under the harsh factory lights. But this isn't an aircraft plant, or at least it wasn't. A year or two earlier, this same space was an assembly line for family sedans. You can almost feel the ghost of the old factory, the memory of chrome and passenger seats, now replaced by aluminum and bomb bays. This image isn't just about building a plane, it's about the complete and total transformation of a nation's industry. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the American military was not the global superpower it would become. The country was still pulling itself out of the Great Depression. The idea of fighting a war on two fronts in Europe and the Pacific seemed impossible. The nation's strength was not in its standing army, but in its industrial potential. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew this. In a radio address in 1940, he called on the nation to become the great arsenal of democracy. It was a powerful phrase, and it became a national mission. After the U.S. officially entered the war, the mission became an urgent reality. The government established the War Production Board in January 1942. Its job was to oversee the conversion of peacetime industries to military production. The change was staggering. A company that made refrigerators started making machine guns, a typewriter factory began producing rifles, and the automotive industry, the heart of American manufacturing, went all in. Civilian car production was halted completely in February 1942. The assembly lines that had perfected mass production for consumers were now tasked with building tanks, trucks, and planes. The photo of the B-24 Liberator was likely taken at the Willow Run plant in Michigan. Built by the Ford Motor Company, Willow Run was the largest factory in the world at the time. It was a symbol of this industrial pivot. Ford's production genius, Charles Sorensen, applied the principles of the automotive assembly line to the complex task of building a four-engine bomber. At its peak, the Willow Run plant was rolling a brand new B-24 off its mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. Think about that. An entire heavy bomber made of 1.2 million parts, assembled in about an hour. This industrial miracle was not without its human cost. Workers poured into industrial centers like Detroit from all over the country, creating massive housing shortages and social tensions. The work was grueling, often dangerous, and the hours were long. But the output was undeniable. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced an astonishing amount of war material, and about 80,000 landing craft, over 100,000 tanks and armored cars, and nearly 300,000 airplanes. This flood of equipment overwhelmed the Axis powers. The historian Richard Overy, in his book Why the Allies Won, argues that the war was ultimately decided not just on the battlefield but on the assembly line. The sheer productive capacity of the American home front was a weapon the enemy could not match. The photograph of the bomber in the car factory captures the heart of that weapon. It is a portrait of a nation remaking itself piece by piece, rivet by rivet, for the sole purpose of survival. But what do the official production numbers fail to tell us? What was the true environmental cost of this unregulated high-speed industrialization with waste and chemicals poured into the land and water? How many small family-owned businesses were permanently destroyed when the government funneled all resources and contracts to major corporations like Ford and General Motors? And In the race for speed, how many safety shortcuts were taken on the factory floors, leading to injuries and deaths that were never officially counted as casualties of war? Number 20, who are the women who built the bombs? Here is a woman. Her hair is tied up in a bandana, her face smudged with grease. She wears sturdy overalls, a man's work clothes. She is not smiling for the camera. Her expression is focused, intense. In her hands, she holds a welding tool, and a shower of sparks illuminates her face. She is building something, a ship, a tank, a plane. She is one of millions. We know her by a nickname, Rosie the Riveter. But that name, and the famous poster it inspired, simplifies a complex reality. The women who entered the workforce during World War II were not a monolith. They were individuals from every corner of the country, and their stories are about more than just patriotic duty. When millions of men left for military service, the country faced a catastrophic labor shortage. The factories that were supposed to be the arsenal of democracy were in danger of falling silent. The solution was obvious, but for many it was radical women. The government, along with private industry, launched a massive propaganda campaign to recruit women into defense jobs. In posters and films portrayed factory work as glamorous and patriotic. The message was clear: you can serve your country right here at home. And women responded. Between 1940 and 1945, the female workforce grew by over 50%. Nearly 19 million women were employed during the war. More than 6 million of them took jobs in the skilled trades in roles previously considered exclusively for men. They became welders, riveters, mechanics, and electricians. This photograph of the female welder captures this profound shift. She is not just filling a man's job, she is mastering it. The work was often physically demanding and dangerous. Women worked with heavy machinery, toxic chemicals, and explosive materials. In her book, The Girls of Atomic City, Denise Kiernan tells the story of the young women who worked at the secret facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, enriching uranium for the atomic bomb, many of them completely unaware of the true purpose of their work. They handled hazardous materials with minimal protection, their health a secondary concern to the urgency of the project. Pay was another issue. Despite government directives for equal pay, women in manufacturing jobs earned, on average, only about 65% of what men did for the same work. And what about their lives outside the factory? Many of these working women were also mothers. The government recognized the need for childcare and provided some funding through the Lanham Act of 1940, which led to the creation of the first large-scale government-sponsored daycare centers in American history. But these centers could only serve a fraction of the children who needed them. Most working mothers had to rely on a patchwork of relatives, neighbors, or older siblings to care for their children while they worked 10 or 12-hour shifts. The image of the woman with the welding torch doesn't show her waking up hours before her shift to get her children ready. It doesn't show her exhaustion at the end of the day, facing a second shift of cooking, cleaning, and caring for her family. When the war ended, the propaganda machine reversed course. Women were encouraged to leave their jobs to make way for the returning soldiers. Many were laid off. But something had changed. These women had proven to the country and to themselves that they could do the work. The experience planted a seed for the women's rights movements that would follow decades later. Rosie the Riveter didn't just help win the war, she started a revolution. We have the statistics on female employment, but what do we not know? How many women suffered from long-term health problems like cancer or respiratory diseases from their exposure to asbestos, lead, and other toxins in the shipyards and factories, illnesses that emerged years after the war? What was the true psychological impact on the latchkey children who spent their formative years with minimal parental supervision? And how many women who were forced out of their skilled jobs after the war carried a quiet resentment and a sense of unfulfilled potential for the rest of their lives? Number 19, could you live on rations? The photograph shows a family at their dinner table. A mother, a father, 2 young children. But something is off. The plates are not full. The father is carving a very small piece of meat. On the corner of the table, next to the salt shaker, sits a small, unassuming booklet. It's a ration book. This single object governed the lives of every person on the home front. The image is not one of dramatic action, but of quiet daily sacrifice. It asks a simple question: what does it take to feed an army? The answer was that it took a little bit from everyone. The United States entered the war with a food surplus, a legacy of the Great Depression's overproduction. But the demands of the war were enormous. Food was needed for millions of American soldiers and also for allied nations like Britain and the Soviet Union, whose own agricultural systems had been devastated. To manage this demand and prevent the kind of hoarding and price gouging that had occurred in World War I, the government instituted a massive rationing program. The Office of Price Administration, or OPA, was created in 1942 to oversee it. The system was complex. It wasn't just about limiting how much you could buy, it was about managing a system of points. Here's how it worked. Every man, woman, and child received a series of ration books. The most important were Book 2, for processed foods, and Book 4 for meats, fats, and dairy. Each book contained stamps of different point values. Each week, the OPA would publish the point price for various items. For example, a pound of ground beef might cost you 7 points, while a can of peaches might be 12 points. Your family had a limited number of points to spend each week, so you had to make choices. If you bought that beef, you might not have enough points left for cheese or butter. It forced families to become meticulous planners and creative cooks. The photo of the family with their meager portion of meat was a reality for millions. Rationing extended far beyond food. Gasoline was one of the first things to be rationed, not because of a shortage of crude oil, but because of a critical shortage of rubber for tires. The government needed rubber for military vehicles, and the primary sources in Southeast Asia were under enemy control. Driving was severely curtailed. Most civilians were issued an A sticker for their car, which entitled them to only 3 to 4 gallons of gas per week. This drastically changed American life, limiting travel and promoting carpooling and public transportation. Other rationed items included sugar, coffee, shoes, and metal goods. The government slogan was, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." People adapted. They learned to cook with less sugar and meat. They patched their clothes and resoled their shoes. They organized swap meats to trade ration stamps. But the system wasn't perfect. A significant black market emerged where people could buy goods illegally at inflated prices. The OPA had an enforcement division with thousands of agents who investigated black market operations, but it was a constant battle. The historian Mark Jonathan Harris, in his documentary The Long Way Home, notes how the shared experience of rationing, despite its hardships, often created a sense of communal effort. Everyone was in it together, from the factory worker to the movie star. The little ration book on the dinner table in the photograph was a constant, tangible reminder that their personal choices were directly connected to the war effort an ocean away. But what parts of this story remain in the shadows? How extensive was the black market really? And how many respectable citizens participated in it, undermining the very system designed for fairness? What was the nutritional impact on children during these crucial developmental years? And did the limited diet have long-term health consequences we've never measured? And how did the OPA's massive bureaucracy, with its power to control the flow of almost every commodity, create opportunities for corruption and favoritism on a local level that never made it into the official records? Number 18, why did a garden become a weapon? In this photo, a small backyard has been completely transformed. Where a patch of grass might have been, there are now neat rows of vegetables. A woman in a simple dress, a teenage boy, and a young girl are all tending the plants. The girl holds a watering can, a look of serious concentration on her face. In the corner of the yard, a handmade sign is stuck in the dirt. It reads, "Victory Garden." This image represents one of the most widespread and successful home front initiatives. It shows how the government mobilized millions of people to fight the war, not with bullets, but with shovels and seeds. The logic behind the Victory Garden program was simple and brilliant. The nation's commercial agriculture system was stretched to its absolute limit, trying to feed the armed forces and the Allies. Every can of commercially grown beans or tomatoes that was shipped overseas was one less can available for civilians at home. The Department of Agriculture, led by Secretary Claude R. Wickard, realized that citizens could fill this gap themselves. In early 1942, the government launched a massive campaign encouraging people to plant their own gardens. The message, promoted through posters, radio programs, and newspaper articles, was that growing your own food was a patriotic act. The response was overwhelming. People everywhere started digging. They turned backyards, vacant lots, city parks, and even rooftops into productive plots of land. In Chicago, gardens were planted in Lincoln Park. In San Francisco, a large garden was cultivated in Golden Gate Park. Even the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, planted a victory garden on the White House lawn, a powerful symbol for the rest of the nation. The government provided instructional pamphlets on how to plant, cultivate, and preserve food. Seed companies developed special Victory Garden seed collections. It became a true community effort. Experienced gardeners shared their knowledge with novices. Neighbors worked together to till difficult soil. The numbers are incredible. By 1943, there were an estimated 20 million victory gardens in the United States. That's more than one garden for every two households, and they weren't just for show. According to the Department of Agriculture in 1944, these home gardens produced roughly 8 million tons of food. That accounted for more than 40% of all the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the country that year. This massive harvest had a direct impact on the war effort. It freed up agricultural resources, eased the burden on the overstrained transportation system, and supplemented the often meager rations available at the grocery store. The photo of the family in their garden captures the spirit of this movement. It was about self-reliance, community, and the idea that even the smallest act, like planting a row of carrots, could contribute to a global victory. Beyond the practical benefits, victory gardens had a powerful psychological effect. In a time of anxiety and uncertainty, gardening gave people a sense of purpose and control. It was a productive way to channel their worries and a tangible way to help the cause. It also brought families and communities together, working toward a common goal. The author Michael Pollan, in his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, discusses how these gardens reconnected people to their food and to the land, a connection that has been largely lost in modern society. The Victory Garden was more than just a source of food. It was a symbol of resilience and a testament to the power of collective action. But what are the unwritten histories of these gardens? How did the widespread use of new chemical pesticides like DDT, which were promoted at the time for garden use, affect the soil and the health of the people who ate the food? Did the program inadvertently create social friction between those with land to garden and those in crowded urban apartments who had no space? And after the war, when the push for home gardening faded and the era of industrial agriculture and processed foods boomed, what traditional knowledge about food preservation and local cultivation was lost, perhaps forever. Number 17, how could a child's wagon help sink a battleship? The photograph is full of youthful energy. A group of children, maybe 8 or 10 years old, are gathered on a sidewalk in front of a neat suburban house. They are clustered around a red toy wagon, the kind every kid had, but the wagon isn't filled with toys. It's overflowing with scrap metal. There's an old pot, a bent license plate, a rusty bicycle frame, and dozens of dented cans. A boy in the center is holding up a sign he clearly made himself. The crayon letters are a little crooked, but the message is proud and clear: junk for Yanks. This scene, repeated in countless neighborhoods across the country, shows how even the youngest citizens were enlisted in the war effort. The demand for raw materials during the war was insatiable. Steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, tin, these were the building blocks of the war machine, and they were in short supply. The government, through the War Production Board, organized a series of nationwide scrap drives. The logic was that every household in America was a potential mine of valuable materials. That old shovel in the garage, the worn-out tires, the collection of tin cans under the sink, all of it could be melted down and recycled into tanks, ships, and bullets. The propaganda was direct and powerful. Posters showed a battleship and declared, "A child's wagon can help sink this." The connection was made explicit. Your trash could become a weapon. Children became the frontline soldiers of these scrap drives. Schools organized contests between classrooms to see who could collect the most. Groups like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts made it a central part of their activities. The kids in the photograph are not just playing, they are working. They are canvassing their neighborhoods, going door to door, asking for any old junk. They learned to distinguish different types of metal. They knew that a pound of fat could be used to make glycerin for explosives. They collected tinfoil, stripping it from cigarette and gum wrappers. They lugged their heavy wagons to central collection depots set up in town squares and schoolyards. The numbers were staggering. A single nationwide scrap rubber drive in 1942 collected almost 450,000 tons of rubber. Metal drives brought in millions of tons of steel and iron. It wasn't just metal and rubber. People were asked to save kitchen fat and grease in coffee cans. Women donated old nylon and silk stockings, which could be used to make parachutes. Even old phonograph records were collected, their shellac used in the production of new records for military radio broadcasts. The historian William M. Tuttle Jr., in his book Daddy's Gone to War, The Second World War and the Lives of America's Children, explores how these activities shaped the worldview of a generation. For these children, the war was not an abstract event happening far away. It was a daily reality that involved them directly. They were active participants doing their part. The scrap drives served a dual purpose. They provided essential raw materials for the war industry, but just as importantly, they were a powerful tool for maintaining morale. They gave every single person, no matter how young or old, a way to contribute. Collecting scrap was a tangible, visible act of patriotism. It made people feel connected to the war effort and reinforced the idea that victory depended on everyone's participation. The image of the children with their wagon of junk is a perfect illustration of this. It's a picture of total mobilization, where the line between the home front and the battlefront blurred, and a child's toy became an instrument of war. But what questions linger about these seemingly innocent drives? How much of the collected material was actually usable, and how much was simply a morale-boosting exercise, with piles of unsortable junk ending up in landfills? Did the constant focus on collection and sacrifice create a generation with a lifelong anxiety about waste and scarcity? And what were the unintended consequences of sending children door to door, sometimes in unfamiliar neighborhoods, in an era before the concept of stranger danger was widely understood? Number 16. What did the world look like in total darkness? This photograph is strange and unsettling. It's a city street at night, but it looks like no city you've ever seen. It's almost completely black. The familiar glow of streetlights is gone. The bright signs of shops and theaters are dark. The windows of the buildings are covered with thick, black material. The only light comes from the headlights of a single car, and even those are masked, painted over so that only a tiny, horizontal slit of light can escape. A man in a helmet and armband, an air raid warden, stands on the corner, his silhouette barely visible. This is a city holding its breath. This is the blackout. For coastal cities in the United States, especially after Pearl Harbor, the threat of enemy air raids was very real. While a large-scale bombing campaign, like the Blitz in London, was unlikely, the fear of surprise attacks was palpable. In response, the Office of Civilian Defense was established to prepare the country for potential attacks. One of its most important and visible programs was the mandatory blackout. The idea was simple: a city cloaked in darkness is a much harder target for enemy bombers to find at night. At the sound of an air raid siren, the entire city was expected to plunge into absolute darkness within minutes. Implementing this was a massive undertaking. Every home and business was required to have blackout curtains or painted windows to prevent any light from escaping. Streetlights were turned off or hooded. Car headlights had to be shielded. Air raid wardens, local volunteers who were the backbone of the civil defense system, patrolled their assigned blocks to enforce the rules. They would knock on doors if they saw even a sliver of light, and had the authority to issue fines to violators. The photo of the warden on the dark street shows a figure of immense local power. These were ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, accountants, teachers, given extraordinary responsibility for their neighbors' safety. Life changed under the blackout. People learned to navigate their cities in the dark. White stripes were painted on curbs and lampposts to prevent accidents. People carried flashlights, often with the lenses covered in red cellophane to make them less visible from the air. The darkness created a new kind of urban experience. It was quiet, eerie, and, for some, frightening. For others, it was a source of novelty and even romance. The historian John Costello, in his book Love, Sex, and War, notes how the blackouts created a strange new social environment, a world of shadows and anonymity. Beyond the blackouts, civil defense involved constant drills. School children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks. Communities built public air raid shelters and designated private basements as safe zones. Spotters were trained to identify enemy aircraft. The entire population was being conditioned to respond instantly to the threat of attack. While the continental United States ultimately suffered very few direct attacks, a handful of shells from a Japanese submarine off the coast of California, and some balloon bombs that drifted across the Pacific, the constant preparedness had a profound psychological impact. The fear was real. The blackout, the sirens, the drills, they were a constant reminder that the war was not just something happening in faraway lands. It could at any moment arrive on your doorstep. The darkened city in the photograph is a portrait of a nation's anxiety, a physical manifestation of a collective fear of the unknown. But what are the hidden stories of the blackout? How much did crime rates increase during these periods of enforced darkness, and were certain communities more vulnerable than others? What was the psychological toll of the constant fear and the disruptive drills, especially on young children who lived with the threat of attack for years? And how did the absolute authority given to volunteer air raid wardens sometimes lead to abuses of power, petty feuds, and the settling of personal scores under the guise of national security? Number 15. What does a government poster tell you to do? The image is a poster designed to be glued to a wall or displayed in a shop window. The colors are bold and simple: red, white, and blue. A stern-looking man, maybe a factory foreman or a concerned father figure, points directly at the viewer. His face is a mask of grim determination. The text below him is short, direct, and impossible to ignore. It might say loose lips sink ships, or someone talked, or do with less, so they'll have enough. This is not art for art's sake. This is propaganda. It is a tool designed to shape your thoughts and control your behavior. During the war, the US government embarked on one of the largest and most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in history. The Office of War Information, OWI, created in 1942, was the central agency responsible for this effort. Its mission was to craft and disseminate the government's message, both at home and abroad. The OWI used every medium available: radio, movies, newspapers, and most visibly, posters. Thousands of different poster designs were created and distributed by the millions. They were everywhere in post offices, factories, schools, and stores. They were the wallpaper of the home front. The messages on these posters can be broken down into a few key themes. One of the most common was the promotion of secrecy and the danger of careless talk. Posters like the famous "Loose lips sink ships" reminded people that enemy spies could be anywhere. A casual remark about a troop movement or a factory's production schedule could have deadly consequences. This created an atmosphere of caution and suspicion. Another major theme was conservation and sacrifice. Posters urged people to save scrap metal, to conserve gasoline, and to abide by rationing rules. They framed these small, personal acts as vital contributions to the war effort. A poster showing a soldier in a foxhole with the caption, "He's giving his all. What about you?" was a powerful form of emotional persuasion. A third category of posters was aimed at recruitment, both for the military and for the industrial workforce. These were the posters that glorified the soldier and celebrated the factory worker, like the iconic "We Can Do It" image often associated with Rosie the Riveter. They were designed to boost morale and foster a sense of national unity. The historian Clayton R. Copies, in his book Hollywood Goes to War, details how the OWI worked closely with film studios to ensure that movies also carried these pro-war messages. Good guys were clearly defined, bad guys were evil, and the American cause was always just. The poster in the photograph, with its pointing finger and accusatory tone, is a perfect example of the government's direct address to the citizen. It is a command, not a request. It speaks to the immense pressure people felt to conform and contribute. The effectiveness of this propaganda is hard to measure precisely, but it undoubtedly played a role in unifying the country behind the war effort. It helped sell billions of dollars in war bonds, encouraged millions to join the workforce, and made rationing and scrap drives a part of daily life. These posters are a window into the mind of a nation at war. They show what the government wanted its people to believe, to fear, and to do. But what did these powerful images conceal? How did the constant barrage of propaganda, with its simple messages of good versus evil, stifle political dissent and debate about the war's aims and conduct? To what extent did the racial and ethnic caricatures used to depict the enemy on some posters contribute to the persecution of minority groups at home? And how did the OUI's carefully crafted version of America, a unified and harmonious nation, deliberately ignore the deep-seated racial and social conflicts that continue to simmer just beneath the surface? Number 14, how do you sell a war? This photograph captures a scene of organized patriotic fervor. It's a rally in a town square, perhaps in the Midwest. A temporary stage has been set up, draped in red, white, and blue bunting. On the stage, a famous movie star is speaking passionately into a microphone. Below the stage, a huge crowd of people listens, their faces turned upward. In front of the stage is a large sign with a thermometer-like graphic showing the town's progress toward a goal. The sign reads, "BUI War Bonds." This was not just about raising money, it was about making every citizen a direct investor in the war. Financing the war was a monumental challenge. The cost ran into the hundreds of billions of dollars, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time. The government could raise some of this money through taxes, but it wasn't enough, and raising taxes too high could cripple the economy and public morale. The solution was a massive public fundraising campaign centered on war bonds. These were essentially loans from citizens to the government. You could buy a Series E bond, for example, for $18.75. In 10 years, the government would pay you back $25. It was a safe, if not particularly lucrative investment, but the government sold them not as a financial instrument, but as an act of patriotic duty. The Treasury Department, under Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., organized a series of 8 massive war loan drives between 1942 and 1945. The campaign was a masterclass in public relations and marketing. The government enlisted the help of Hollywood's biggest stars. Actors like Bette Davis, Hedy Lamarr, and Clark Gable crisscrossed the country on Bond tours, like the one depicted in the photograph. They appeared at rallies, visited factories, and used their star power to persuade people to open their wallets. These tours were incredibly effective. A single tour featuring actress Dorothy Lamour reportedly sold over $350 million in bonds. The campaign was relentless and reached into every corner of American life. Children were encouraged to buy war stamps for as little as 10 cents, which they could paste into a booklet until they had enough to purchase a full bond. Businesses were pressured to implement payroll deduction plans, automatically taking bond payments from employees' paychecks. The social pressure was intense. In many communities, lists were published of who had and had not bought bonds. Those who didn't participate were often seen as unpatriotic. Posters, radio shows, and movies all carried the same message: buying bonds would help bring the soldiers home sooner. They made the connection: direct your $18.75 could buy a life raft, your $100 could buy a parachute. The results were astonishing. Over the course of the war, more than 85 million Americans, over half the population, purchased war bonds. In total, the bond drives raised over $185 billion. That's the equivalent of several trillion dollars today. This money was crucial for funding the production of planes, ships, and other war materials. But the bond drives achieved something just as important as raising money. As noted by historian Mark K. Updegrove in his work on presidential leadership, the campaign gave civilians a powerful sense of participation. It was a way to have skin in the game. When you owned a war bond, you weren't just a spectator, you were a stakeholder in the outcome. The rally in the photograph is not just a celebrity appearance, it is a ritual of public commitment, a moment where a community came together to collectively invest its money and its faith in victory. But what are the untold stories behind this phenomenal success? How much of the bond purchasing was truly voluntary, and how much was the result of intense peer pressure and the fear of being publicly shamed? To what extent did employers coerce their workers into participating in payroll deduction plans? And what was the long-term economic effect on the millions of low-income families who invested their meager savings in these low-yield bonds, forgoing other opportunities for the sake of patriotism? It's number 13. What happens when your own country sees you as the enemy? The photograph is stark and heartbreaking. A little girl no more than 7 or 8 years old stands on a dusty street. She is wearing a simple cotton dress and holding a small doll. Behind her, a wooden barracks stretches into the distance, surrounded by a barbed wire fence. In the background, a watchtower is visible against the sky. The girl is an American citizen, but she is also a prisoner. This is a Japanese-American internment camp. The image is a quiet but devastating indictment of a nation's fear and prejudice. In the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a wave of anti-Japanese hysteria swept across the West Coast. Fueled by decades of racial prejudice and fears of espionage and sabotage, politicians, military leaders, and media outlets began calling for the removal of all people of Japanese descent from the coastal areas. There was no evidence of any widespread disloyalty or conspiracy among the Japanese American community. The FBI and naval intelligence had both concluded that they posed no significant threat, but the fear was stronger than the facts. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. This seemingly neutral language was used to target one specific group: Japanese Americans. Approximately 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were native-born American citizens, were forced to leave their homes. They were given just days to sell or store their property, their houses, their farms, their businesses. They could only take what they could carry. They were first herded into temporary assembly centers, often hastily converted racetracks or fairgrounds where they lived in horse stalls. From there, they were transported by train to 10 permanent relocation centers in remote, desolate parts of the country, places like Manzanar in California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and Topaz in Utah. The photograph of the little girl captures the human reality of this policy. These camps were prisons. They were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Families were housed in single rooms in tar paper-covered barracks with no plumbing or privacy. They endured extreme temperatures, dust storms, and the profound psychological trauma of being incarcerated by their own country. Despite these conditions, the internees attempted to create a semblance of normal life. They established schools, churches, and newspapers. They organized sports teams and art classes. The photographer Ansel Adams documented life at the Manzanar camp, and his book, Born Free and Equal, sought to show the dignity and resilience of the people held there. Some Japanese Americans challenged the legality of the internment. In the landmark case, Korematsu v. United States 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the government's actions, ruling that the need to protect against espionage outweighed the individual rights of Fred Korematsu and other Japanese Americans. It is a decision that is now widely regarded as one of the court's most egregious errors. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, many of whom had families in the internment camps, became the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. They fought to prove their loyalty to a country that had imprisoned their loved ones. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized for the internment and paid reparations to the survivors. But no amount of money could erase the injustice. The little girl in the photograph stands as a permanent reminder of how, in a time of war, fear can cause a nation to betray its most fundamental ideals. But even with the official apology, what parts of the story are not fully understood? What was the true economic loss suffered by the families who had to abandon their property, and how many of them were never able to recover financially? How did the experience of internment affect the mental health of the survivors and their children for generations to come? And what happened to the complex social networks, cultural institutions, and community bonds within the Japanese American community that were shattered by the forced relocation and never fully rebuilt? Number 12. How do you fight a war on two fronts at once? In this photograph, a group of young African American men are standing proudly in front of a fighter plane. They are pilots dressed in flight gear. The plane's tail is painted red, a distinctive marking. These are the Tuskegee Airmen. But the picture represents something more than just a group of flyers. It symbolizes a struggle within a struggle. For African Americans during World War II, the fight was not just against the Axis powers abroad, it was also against racism and discrimination at home. This was the Double V campaign. When the war began, the U.S. military was segregated. African Americans were restricted to non-combat roles, often serving as cooks, drivers, or laborers. The idea of a black pilot or officer was unthinkable to many in the military leadership. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, saw the war as an opportunity to demand change. They argued that it was hypocritical for the United States to fight for freedom and democracy abroad, while denying those same things to its own citizens. Randolph threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941 to protest discrimination in the defense industry and the military. To avert the march, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in the defense industry and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This was a major victory, but the fight for equality in the military continued. The Double V campaign, a term coined by the influential African-American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, captured the spirit of this two-front war. The first V stood for victory over the enemy overseas. The second V stood for victory over racism at home. This slogan was embraced by the black community. It was a rallying cry for civil rights and a statement that they would not accept second-class citizenship while fighting for their country. The Tuskegee Airmen, the subjects of the photograph, became the most famous symbol of the Double V campaign. After intense pressure from civil rights groups, the Army Air Corps established a program to train black pilots at a separate facility in Tuskegee, Alabama. Many in the military establishment expected the program to fail, believing that African Americans lacked the intelligence and courage to fly in combat. The Tuskegee Airmen proved them spectacularly wrong. Flying fighter planes, known as Red Tails for their distinctive markings, they escorted American bombers on missions over Europe. They were so successful that they earned a reputation as one of the best escort groups in the Air Force. Bomber crews specifically requested the Red Tails, knowing their chances of survival were higher with them. They flew over 1,500 missions and never lost a single bomber they were escorting to enemy fighters, a record no other group could claim. The experiences of African American soldiers were not all heroic. They faced constant prejudice from white officers and enlisted men. Race riots broke out on military bases in the United States, and when black veterans returned home after the war, they were often denied the benefits of the GI Bill and faced the same Jim Crow segregation they had left behind. But, as documented by the historian Stephen Ambrose in Citizen Soldiers, their service had changed them. They had seen a world without segregation and had proven their courage and patriotism. Their determination to fight for their rights at home was stronger than ever. The Double V campaign and the achievements of soldiers like the Tuskegee Airmen laid the groundwork for the modern civil rights movement that would explode in the following decade. The men in the photograph were not just fighting a war, they were fighting for the very soul of America. But what parts of the Double V story have been underreported? How many acts of quiet resistance and protest by black soldiers against segregation within the military were brutally suppressed and erased from official records? What was the experience of African American women who served in segregated units like the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, whose crucial work in Europe was largely ignored for decades? And how did the government's own propaganda, which often portrayed a unified all-white America, contribute to the invisibility and marginalization of the 1 million African Americans who served in the armed forces? Number 11. How does the mailman deliver a broken heart? The photograph is quiet and devastatingly simple. A woman stands on the porch of her home. Her hand is on the screen door as if she has just opened it. In her other hand, she holds a small piece of paper, a telegram. Her face is a study in shock and dawning horror. She is not crying yet. She is in that terrible frozen moment just after reading the words she has prayed she would never see. The words that begin, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you. For the families on the home front, the mail was a lifeline." Letters from sons, husbands, and fathers overseas were read and reread, passed around among family and friends. They were a precious connection to a loved one in danger, a tangible piece of their existence. The wait between letters was a time of gnawing anxiety. But there was another kind of mail, another kind of messenger that everyone dreaded. A visit from a Western Union courier carrying a telegram. When a soldier was killed in action, the news was relayed from the military command to the War Department in Washington, D.C. From there, it was sent via telegraph to the Western Union office nearest the family's home. A local courier, often a teenage boy on a bicycle, would then deliver the telegram. This system, designed for efficiency, was profoundly impersonal and often brutal in its delivery. The woman in the photograph is experiencing the moment that millions of families feared above all others. In an instant, her world has been shattered by a piece of paper. The historian Judy Barrett Lidoff has curated collections of wartime letters, such as "Since You Went Away," which highlight the constant undercurrent of fear that ran beneath the surface of everyday life for these families. Once the initial shock passed, the family entered a new reality. A small banner with a blue star, which many families displayed in their window to indicate a family member in service, would be replaced by one with a gold star. These gold star mothers and families became a powerful and somber symbol of the war's ultimate cost. They were a community of shared grief, supporting each other through an unimaginable loss. The government provided a small death gratuity and later life insurance payments, but no amount of money could compensate for the loss. The sheer numbers are difficult to comprehend. Over 400,000 American service members died during World War II. Each of those deaths represented a telegram delivered, a family devastated, and a community in mourning. The ripple effects were immense. Wives became widows, children became fatherless, and parents buried their sons. The experience of receiving that telegram was so seared into the national consciousness that it became a common trope in wartime films and stories. But the fictional depictions could never fully capture the stark reality of that moment. The photograph of the woman on her porch is powerful because it is so unadorned. There is no drama, no heroic music. There is only the quiet, private, and absolute finality of loss. It is a portrait of the home front as its own kind of battlefield where the casualties were counted, not in soldiers, but in broken hearts. But what do we not know about this process of grief and notification? How many notification telegrams contain errors, misidentifying the deceased, or being delivered to the wrong family, causing unimaginable confusion and pain? What were the long-term psychological effects on the Western Union couriers, often just boys, who were tasked with delivering this devastating news day after day? And how did families in rural, isolated areas far from telegraph offices receive the news? And how long did they sometimes have to wait, living in a state of unknowing after their loved one was already gone? Number 10, did you know a farmer could be a soldier? The photograph shows a man on a tractor, driving across a vast field of wheat that stretches to the horizon. The sun is low, casting long shadows. The man's face is weathered, his hands are steady on the wheel. He is not in uniform, he is not carrying a rifle, but he is as essential to the war effort as any soldier. This is a farmer, and his field is a battlefield. His weapons are a plow and a combine. His mission is to feed the world. When we think of the arsenal of democracy, we usually think of factories churning out tanks and planes. But food was just as critical a weapon of war. A well-fed army can fight. A starving army cannot. A well-fed civilian population can work in the factories and maintain morale. A hungry population cannot. President Roosevelt famously called food a weapon in the war against the Axis. The American farmer was on the front lines of producing that weapon. The challenge was immense. The war created a massive labor shortage on farms, just as it did in the cities. Millions of farmers and farmhands left to join the military or to take higher-paying jobs in defense industries. At the same time, the demand for food skyrocketed. The U.S. had to feed its own 16 million service members, its civilian population, and provide massive amounts of food to its allies through the Lend-Lease program. Britain, for example, was heavily dependent on American food imports to prevent starvation. The task fell to the farmers, who remained the older men, the women, and the children. They had to produce more food with fewer people. They succeeded through a combination of hard work, ingenuity, and government support. The war accelerated the mechanization of agriculture. Farmers who could afford it invested in new tractors, combines, and other machinery to replace human labor. The government, through the War Food Administration, set production goals and offered price supports to encourage farmers to plant more. There were also programs to help with the labor shortage. The Women's Land Army recruited women from cities and towns to work on farms during planting and harvest seasons. And in a controversial move, the Bracero program was established in 1942, an agreement with Mexico that brought hundreds of thousands of Mexican guest workers to the U.S. to work in agriculture. The results of this effort were nothing short of miraculous. Despite having 10% fewer workers, American farms increased their output by over 30% during the war years. They produced record harvests of corn, wheat, and other essential crops. They also produced vast quantities of meat, dairy, and eggs. This agricultural abundance was a key strategic advantage for the Allies. As the historian Douglas E. Hurt argues in American Agriculture, A Brief History, the productivity of the American farmer was a decisive factor in the war's outcome. The man on the tractor in the photograph represents this quiet, unheralded army of the home front. His work was not glamorous. It did not come with medals or parades. It was a relentless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting dictated by the seasons and the weather. But it was absolutely vital. Every bushel of wheat he harvested was a blow against the enemy. Every gallon of milk was a contribution to the strength of the Allied nations. The amber waves of grain in the photograph are not just a landscape, they are a symbol of a nation's strength, a testament to the fact that wars are won not only by soldiers with guns, but also by farmers on tractors. But what are the forgotten stories of this agricultural miracle? What was the experience of the Mexican bracero workers who often faced exploitation, poor living conditions, and discrimination, a part of the story often left out of the triumphant narrative? How did the wartime push for maximum production, which encouraged the heavy use of chemical fertilizers and the planting of fence row to fence row, set the stage for the long-term environmental problems of industrial agriculture? And what happened to the thousands of small family farms that couldn't compete with larger mechanized operations and were forced to sell out during this period of rapid change? Number 9, what did a movie star do for the troops? The photograph shows a makeshift stage, probably on the back of a flatbed truck. It's set up in what looks like a muddy field at a military base. A crowd of thousands of soldiers, all in uniform, surrounds the stage. They are cheering, laughing, their faces filled with a joy and relief that momentarily erases the exhaustion of war. On the stage, a glamorous woman is singing. It could be Marlene Dietrich, it could be Betty Grable. It doesn't matter who it is. What matters is what she represents: a connection to home, a moment of escape, a reminder of what they were fighting for. This is the USO. Morale is a critical, if intangible, element of warfare. A soldier who feels forgotten and alone is not an effective soldier. Recognizing this, 6 civilian organizations, including the IMSA, the Salvation Army, and the National Jewish Welfare Board, came together in 1941 at the request of President Roosevelt to form the United Service Organizations, or USO. Its mission was simple: to be a home away from home for American service members. The USO was not a government agency, it was a private, non-profit organization funded by donations from the American people. The USO's work took 2 main forms. First, there were the USO clubs, Over 3,000 of these clubs were established in the United States and abroad. They were places where soldiers could go to relax, read a newspaper, write a letter home, have a snack, or listen to music. The clubs were staffed by volunteers, many of them young women who served as hostesses. They would dance with the soldiers, listen to their stories, and provide a sense of normalcy and friendly companionship. For a young soldier far from home, a few hours at a USO club could be a powerful antidote to loneliness and fear. The second and more famous part of the USO's work was the entertainment. This is what the photograph captures. The USO's camp shows, division-organized tours of entertainers who traveled to military bases around the world, often performing in dangerous frontline conditions. The biggest stars in Hollywood and the music industry volunteered their time. Comedian Bob Hope became arguably the most famous USO performer, traveling millions of miles and performing hundreds of shows for the troops. But it wasn't just the big names. Thousands of lesser-known actors, singers, dancers, and magicians also joined the USO circuit. These shows were a lifeline for the soldiers. In his memoir, With the Old Breed, Eugene Sledge, a Marine who fought in the brutal Pacific Campaign, describes how a simple USO show provided a desperately needed respite from the horror of combat. For an hour or two, the soldiers could forget where they were. They could laugh at a comedian's jokes, listen to a popular song, and feel connected to the culture they had left behind. The performers themselves often put themselves at great risk. They flew on military transport planes, slept in tents, and performed just miles from the fighting. Their contribution to the war effort was not in fighting, but in sustaining the will to fight. The woman on the stage in the photograph is not just singing a song. She is delivering a message from the home front. We have not forgotten you, but what are the less glamorous truths behind the USO's celebrated history? How did the organization grapple with the issue of race, often maintaining segregated clubs and sending out separate black and white entertainment troops? What was the emotional toll on the thousands of young female volunteers who served as hostesses, who were expected to be friendly and cheerful while constantly saying goodbye to young men who might not survive the week? And how many USO performers suffered from their own forms of trauma after witnessing the brutal realities of the war up close, experiences they rarely spoke about publicly. Number 8, how did a miracle drug change everything? Look at this photograph. It's a laboratory filled with glass beakers, tubes, and strange-looking vats. A woman in a white lab coat is carefully inspecting a shallow dish. Inside the dish is a substance that looks like mold. It's not a dramatic image. There are no soldiers, no explosions. But what is happening in this quiet room is as important to winning the war as any battle. This is the production of penicillin, and it would change the history of medicine forever. Before World War II, a soldier was almost as likely to die from an infection as from an enemy bullet. A deep wound, a surgical incision, or a common illness like pneumonia could easily become a death sentence. Doctors had few tools to fight bacterial infections. The discovery of penicillin by the Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming in 1928 was a breakthrough, but it remained a laboratory curiosity for over a decade. He had observed that a particular mold, Penicillium notatum, could kill bacteria, but producing it in large enough quantities to be used as a medicine seemed impossible. The outbreak of the war made this challenge a desperate necessity. The potential to save thousands of lives from wound infections was a powerful motivator. In 1941, a team of scientists from Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, brought a small amount of the penicillin mold to the United States. They hoped that American industry could solve the production problem. They began working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's lab in Peoria, Illinois. It was there that a key breakthrough occurred. A lab assistant, Mary Hunt, nicknamed Moldy Mary, found a cantaloupe in a local market that was covered in a pretty golden mold. This strain of penicillium, proved to be far more productive than the original one. The U.S. government, through the Office of Scientific Research and Development, declared penicillin production a national priority. A consortium of major pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb, pooled their resources and knowledge to tackle the problem. They developed a new method of growing the mold in large, deep fermentation tanks rather than in shallow dishes. The photo of the lab with its vats likely shows this new industrial-scale process. The challenges were enormous. The mold was temperamental and contamination was a constant problem, but the scientists and engineers persisted. By 1943, they were producing enough penicillin to treat a few hundred cases. By the time of the D-Day invasion in June 1944, They had produced over 2.3 million doses, enough to treat every wounded Allied soldier. The impact was revolutionary. The death rate from bacterial pneumonia in the armed forces fell from 18% to less than 1%. Soldiers who would have certainly died from infected wounds or post-surgical infections were now being saved. The drug was so precious that in the early days, a patient's urine was collected so the penicillin, which is excreted by the body, could be extracted and reused. The story of penicillin, as told in books like The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat by Eric Lax, is a testament to the power of scientific collaboration and industrial might. The quiet, scientific work shown in the photograph had a direct and dramatic effect on the battlefield. It saved countless lives and gave doctors a powerful new weapon. After the war, penicillin became widely available to the civilian population, ushering in the age of antibiotics and transforming medicine forever. Many of the diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries were suddenly treatable. The legacy of this wartime effort is still with us today in every doctor's office and hospital around the world. But what are the unanswered questions about this medical revolution? In the frantic race to produce penicillin, what other potential antibiotic molds or substances were discovered but then abandoned and forgotten, potentially holding cures we are still seeking today? How many of the early clinical trials were conducted on vulnerable populations like prisoners or institutionalized individuals without their full consent? And did the immediate widespread success of penicillin create a sense of medical overconfidence, leading to the overuse of antibiotics that has contributed to the modern crisis of antibiotic-resistant bacteria? Number 7, could you recognize your own street from the sky? This photograph is a bird's eye view, but not of a familiar landscape. It shows a miniature town, a perfect scale model. There are tiny houses, little streets, a small church, a bridge. It looks like a model railroad set. But the people working on it are not hobbyists. They are women in simple work clothes, and their expressions are serious. They are carefully placing buildings, painting details. This is not a toy. This is a target. The model they are building is of a German or Japanese city, and it will be used to brief bomber crews before a mission. Intelligence and planning were crucial components of the Allied war effort, particularly for the strategic bombing campaigns. To send a formation of bombers hundreds or thousands of miles to a specific target, a factory, a rail yard, a submarine pen required incredibly detailed information. Their crews needed to know what their target looked like, the landmarks they would pass on the way, and where the anti-aircraft defenses were likely to be. This is where the model makers came in. This highly secret work was often done by women, many of whom had backgrounds in art, architecture, or design. At places like the Royal Air Force's Medmenham facility in Britain, or at secret locations in the United States, these women used reconnaissance photos to build meticulous three-dimensional models of enemy territory. The aerial photographs were taken by high-altitude spy planes, often flying dangerous solo missions. The model makers would then use these flat, two-dimensional images to construct a world in miniature. The level of detail was extraordinary. They would replicate the exact layout of the streets, the shape and height of the buildings, the location of key infrastructure. As described in Sarah Jane Stratford's historical novel, The Midnight Front, which touches on this hidden world, the work required immense patience and precision. The women would use a variety of materials: wood, clay, plaster, cardboard to create their models. They would then paint them to match the colors and textures of the real location. The final models were often built on large tables, sometimes filling entire rooms. Before a major bombing raid, the pilots, navigators, and bombardiers would be brought into the model room. They would study the model intently, memorizing the approach path, identifying their specific target, and noting potential escape routes. The model gave them a pilot's eye view of their destination, something a flat map could never do. It helped them visualize the mission before they ever left the ground. For a young man about to fly into a heavily defended city, this kind of preparation could be the difference between life and death. The work of the women in the photograph was directly linked to the survival of the men in the air. This photograph offers a glimpse into one of the many hidden behind-the-scenes roles that were essential to the war. The work was not public, it was not glorious, the women who did it received little recognition, but their quiet, painstaking labor was a vital part of the military machine. They were the eyes of the bomber crews. They translated sterile reconnaissance data into a tangible reality that could be understood and used. The image of them hunched over their tiny, perfect city is a powerful symbol of the intellectual and artistic skills that were harnessed for the war effort. It is a reminder that in total war, even an artist's hand can become a weapon. But what secrets do these models still hold? How many of the models were based on faulty intelligence, sending crews to the wrong targets or into unanticipated danger? What was the psychological effect on the women who spent their days meticulously recreating cities, knowing that their work was helping to plan for the destruction of those same places and the people in them? And how many of these incredible detailed models were destroyed after the war? Their value as historical artifacts and works of art unrecognized, their secrets lost forever. Number 6, what sound did an entire nation wait for? The photo shows a family gathered in their living room. A mother, a father, and 2 children are sitting on the floor, their bodies clustered around a large wooden radio console. No one is speaking. All of them are leaning in, their faces tight with concentration, their eyes fixed on the radio speaker grill as if they could see the person talking. It is evening. The light from a single lamp casts a warm glow on the scene. They are listening, and what they are listening to is shaping their understanding of the world. During World War II, radio was the central nervous system of the nation. It was the primary source of news and information, the main provider of entertainment, and a direct link between the leaders in Washington and the people in their homes. Unlike newspapers, which reported on what had already happened, radio offered a sense of immediacy. The voices of news correspondents like Edward R. Murrow, broadcasting from London during the Blitz with his famous opening, "This is London," brought the sounds of the war directly into American living rooms. His calm, descriptive reports made the distant conflict feel real and personal. The family in the photograph is participating in a daily ritual for millions of Americans. They are listening to the news, they are waiting for updates from the front lines, for reports on the progress of the Allied forces, for any information about the war that so dominated their lives. But they were also listening to their president, Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats. A series of radio addresses he gave throughout his presidency were a masterful use of the new medium. He spoke in a calm, reassuring, and conversational tone as if he were a guest in the room. During the war, these chats were crucial for explaining his policies, boosting morale, and unifying the country. He would talk about production goals, the need for sacrifice, and the principles the nation was fighting for. The radio made the president's voice a familiar and trusted presence in nearly every American home. But radio was not just for serious news and presidential addresses. It was also the main source of entertainment and escape. In an era before television, families gathered to listen to comedy shows like Fibber McGee and Molly, suspenseful dramas like The Shadow, and musical programs featuring the big bands of Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. This entertainment was vital for morale. It provided a distraction from the anxieties of war and a sense of shared cultural experience. The Glenn Miller Orchestra, in fact, became part of the Army Air Forces and broadcast its music to troops around the world. The government also used radio extensively for propaganda. The Office of War Information produced its own radio dramas and inserted pro-war messages into popular entertainment shows. Advertisers on the radio linked their products to the war effort, urging people to buy their brand of coffee or soap as a patriotic act. The radio was a powerful tool for shaping public opinion, and the government used it to its full advantage. The family in the photograph is not just passively receiving information. They are being connected, mobilized, and persuaded by the sounds coming from that wooden box. The radio was the invisible thread that tied the entire home front together, creating a shared national experience in a way that had never been possible before. But what did the radio not tell them? How much did government censorship, both official and self-imposed by the networks, control the news that Americans heard, filtering out stories of military blunders or the true extent of casualties? To what extent did the comforting, patriotic tone of most radio programming create a naive and sanitized view of the war, shielding civilians from its true horror? And what were the whispered conversations and secret fears shared in the room after the radio was turned off, the anxieties that the official broadcasts could never fully quell? Number 5. When a car disappears, what takes its place? This photograph shows a busy city street, but something is missing cars. The wide avenues are almost empty of private automobiles. Instead, the street is filled with people. People on bicycles, dozens of them. People walking. A crowded streetcar rumbles down the tracks in the center of the road. A few commercial trucks are visible, but the personal car, the symbol of American freedom and mobility, has all but vanished. This is a city that has been forced to change how it moves. The reason for the empty streets was the severe rationing of 2 key commodities, gasoline and rubber. As mentioned before, the A sticker on a civilian car's windshield entitled the owner to only a few gallons of gas per week. This was not enough for daily commuting or casual driving, but the even more critical shortage was rubber. When Japan conquered Southeast Asia early in the war, it cut off the United States from over 90% of its natural rubber supply. Rubber was essential for military tires, for aircraft, for warships. There was simply none to spare for civilian use. The government banned the sale of new tires for private cars and launched a massive scrap rubber drive. This forced a dramatic shift in American transportation habits. The nation's love affair with the automobile was put on hold. People had to find other ways to get to work, to school, to the store. The solutions are visible in the photograph. Bicycles, once seen as a child's toy or a recreational item, became a primary mode of transportation for adults. E-bike sales boomed. People who hadn't ridden a bike in years dusted off old ones and took to the streets. Public transportation systems, which had been in decline with the rise of the automobile, saw a massive resurgence. Streetcars and buses were packed to overflowing at all hours. As the historian Michael Arfane notes in his studies of urban transit, these systems were strained to their breaking point, trying to move millions of workers to and from the newly bustling defense plants. Well, carpooling, or car sharing as it was called, became not just a suggestion but a patriotic duty. Government posters urged people to share your car, spare the rubber. Air factories organized ride-sharing programs for their employees. Driving alone was seen as wasteful and selfish. The pleasure driving ban, enacted in 1942, made it illegal to use your car for non-essential trips. A Sunday drive in the country was a thing of the past. The national speed limit was lowered to 35 miles per hour, dubbed the Victory speed, to conserve both fuel and tire rubber. These changes had a profound effect on the rhythm of daily life. People's worlds shrank. They stayed closer to home, and neighborhoods became more self-sufficient, with people relying on local shops rather than driving to larger stores. The photograph of the car-less street is a striking image of a society making a collective sacrifice. It shows how quickly people can adapt their behavior when faced with a national crisis. The changes were inconvenient, but they were largely accepted as a necessary part of the war effort. The empty streets were a constant, visible reminder of the resources being diverted to the military. It was a quieter, slower-paced world, one where the sound of bicycle bells and streetcar gongs replaced the roar of automobile engines. It was a temporary reality, but one that demonstrated the profound impact of the war on the most mundane aspects of American life. But what are the forgotten consequences of this transportation shift? How did the severe limits on driving affect people in rural areas who lacked access to public transportation and were more isolated than ever? Did the crowded conditions on buses and streetcars contribute to the spread of infectious diseases like influenza? And what was the long-term impact on urban planning as the temporary resurgence of public transit was quickly abandoned after the war in favor of a renewed and supercharged commitment to the automobile and the highway system? Number 4, who looked after the children? In this photograph, a large bright room is filled with about 20 small children. They are sitting at low tables, playing with wooden blocks and looking at picture books. A few women in simple smocks are supervising them, smiling down at their young charges. In the background, you could see rows of small cots for nap time. This looks like a modern daycare center, but it's not. This is a child care center from the 1940s, a new and revolutionary concept for its time, created out of wartime necessity. With millions of women entering the workforce, the nation faced a crisis who would take care of their children. The Rosie the Riveter propaganda celebrated the woman in the factory, but it rarely showed who was looking after her kids. The traditional support systems of extended family and neighbors were stretched thin. The federal government, realizing that the child care problem was a direct threat to war production, took an unprecedented step. And under the Community Facilities Act of 1941, commonly known as the Lanham Act, the government provided funding for the creation of child care centers in communities with large defense industries. This was a radical idea. Before the war, organized child care was rare and often associated with charity for the poor. The prevailing belief was that a mother's place was in the home. But the war changed that. The government and industry leaders understood that they could not get the female workers they needed unless some provision was made for their children. The Kaiser Company, which ran massive shipyards on the West Coast, became a pioneer in this field. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, with the help of child development experts, established 2 state-of-the-art 24-hour child care centers near his shipyards in Portland, Oregon. These were not just babysitting services. As described by historian William M. Tuttle Jr., they were comprehensive child development centers. They were staffed by trained teachers, they provided nutritious meals, medical care, and educational activities. The Kaiser Centers even had an innovative service where mothers could order a hot meal to take home with them after their shift, easing the second shift of domestic work. The photograph of the well-run, cheerful center captures the ideal of this program. It shows a world where children could be safe, happy, and well cared for while their mothers contributed to the war effort. However, the reality for most working mothers was not this ideal. The Lanham centers, while groundbreaking, were not nearly enough. At their peak, they only served about 130,000 children, a tiny fraction of the millions who needed care. Many communities were resistant to the idea of federally funded childcare, seeing it as a threat to traditional family structures. Many mothers were hesitant to use the centers, fearing social stigma. As a result, the majority of working mothers had to rely on a precarious patchwork of other arrangements. They left their children with relatives, paid unlicensed caregivers of varying quality, or, in many cases, left them at home alone. The term latchkey children became common during the war, referring to kids who wore a house key on a string around their necks so they could let themselves in after school. The photograph of the daycare center, then, represents both a remarkable social innovation and a promise that was only partially fulfilled. It shows what was possible, the kind of supportive infrastructure that could enable women to participate fully in the workforce. But it also highlights the gap between that possibility and the difficult reality faced by most working families. When the war ended, the government's commitment to childcare evaporated, the Lanham Act funding was withdrawn, and most of the centers were closed. The women were encouraged to return to the home, and the national conversation about childcare was largely silenced for another generation. But what are the hidden stories of these wartime children? How many accidents, injuries, and cases of neglect occurred among the latchkey children that were never officially reported? What was the long-term psychological impact on children who were cared for in a constantly shifting series of informal arrangements? And what if the Lanham Act child care program had been continued and expanded after the war? How might American society and the role of women within it be different today? Number 3, what do you do when the fighting stops? This photograph is one of the most famous in American history. It is VJ Day, August 14th, 1945, in Times Square, New York City. The street is packed with a jubilant celebrating crowd. In the center of the frame, a sailor has grabbed a nurse in a white uniform and is kissing her, dipping her back in a dramatic embrace. It is a picture of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. The war is over. The long years of struggle, sacrifice, and anxiety have come to an end. This image captures the explosion of relief and joy that swept across the country. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 VE Day had been a moment of celebration, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the brutal war in the Pacific was still raging. The announcement of Japan's surrender in August, following the use of atomic weapons, brought the final, definitive end to the global conflict. The news spread like wildfire. People poured out of their homes, offices, and factories and into the streets. In cities and towns across the country, spontaneous celebrations erupted. The scene in Times Square, immortalized by photographer Alfred Eisenstadt, was repeated everywhere. Strangers hugged and kissed. People sang and danced. The noise was deafening. It was a moment of profound collective relief. The threat of telegrams from the War Department was gone. The blackouts and air raid drills were over. The rationing that had constrained daily life for years would soon end. And most importantly, the 16 million Americans serving in the armed forces would be coming home. The kiss in the photograph is more than just a kiss. It is a symbol of reunion, of life returning, of a future that was no longer uncertain. It is the physical expression of a nation's joy. But beneath the surface of this euphoric moment, a deep anxiety was also present. The country had completely transformed itself to fight the war. Now, it had to transform itself back to a peacetime society. And no one was quite sure how to do it. The questions were enormous. What would happen when the 12 million men and women still in the military were demobilized and came home looking for jobs? What would happen to the millions of women and minority workers who had taken jobs in the defense industries? Would the economy collapse back into a depression, as many economists feared, without the massive stimulus of government war spending? The transition was not easy. There were housing shortages as veterans returned and started families. There were labor strikes as unions fought to maintain the gains they had made during the war. Women were pushed out of their factory jobs to make way for the returning men, often against their will. The racial tensions that had been suppressed during the war reemerged, sometimes violently. The joy of VJ Day was real, but it was also temporary. The challenges of building a new post-war America were just beginning. The photograph captures the peak of the celebration, the single moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness before the difficult realities of peace set in. It is a portrait of an ending, but also the prelude to a new and uncertain beginning. But what do we not know about this iconic moment of celebration? The identity of the sailor and nurse in the famous photograph was unknown for decades and is still debated by some. How many other powerful personal stories from that day were never recorded and are lost to time? How did the celebrations in different communities, particularly in minority neighborhoods, differ from the mainstream narrative, and what other emotions besides joy, perhaps anxiety about the future or anger about past injustices, were present? And how quickly did the sense of national unity, so powerful in that moment, begin to fracture as different groups started competing for jobs, housing, and a place in the new post-war America? Number 2, what did a soldier carry in his heart? The photograph is small and worn. Its corners are soft, its surface creased. It's a studio portrait of a young woman smiling. She is dressed in the style of the early 1940s. It is a simple, ordinary photograph, but its context makes it extraordinary. This photo was found in the wallet of a soldier. It has been carried across oceans, through training camps, into battle. It is a tangible piece of home, a talisman against fear and loneliness. For the millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen serving overseas, maintaining a connection to home was a matter of psychological survival. The primary means of this connection was mail. Letters from home were more precious than food or sleep. They were read until they fell apart, but letters were just words on a page. A photograph was something different. It was a face, it was a physical reminder of a wife, a sweetheart, a mother, a child. It was a reason to keep fighting, a symbol of the life that was waiting for them if they survived. The woman in the photograph represents the millions of women on the home front who waited. Their war was not one of combat, but of anxiety and endurance. They ran households, raised children, and often worked full-time jobs, all under the constant shadow of worry. Their lives were put on hold, their futures dependent on the outcome of a war being fought thousands of miles away. They wrote letters constantly, filling them with news of home, gossip about neighbors, and reassurances of their love and faithfulness. They were trying to maintain a thread of normalcy across an abyss of distance and danger. The culture of the home front was filled with songs and movies about this dynamic of separation and longing. Songs like "I'll Be Seeing You" and "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anyone Else But Me" captured the mix of romance, nostalgia, and anxiety that defined wartime relationships. Hollywood produced films that glorified the loyal girl back home, waiting patiently for her soldier to return. This idealized image was a powerful morale booster, both for the men at the front and the women at home. The reality was, of course, more complicated. The long separations strained relationships to the breaking point. The famous Dear John letter, in which a woman would write to a soldier to end their relationship, became a source of dread. But for most, the bond held. The photograph in the wallet was a symbol of that bond. It was a private, personal object carried into the most public and violent of conflicts. In his book, Wartime, the writer Paul Fussell, a veteran himself, explores the deep importance of these small, personal rituals and objects in helping soldiers cope with the dehumanizing reality of war. The photograph was a way to hold on to one's individual identity, to remember that you were not just a number or a uniform, but a person with a life and a future. This small, creased photograph is one of the most intimate and powerful images of the home front. It represents the invisible ties that stretched across the globe, connecting the battlefront to the home front. It is a portrait of love, of hope, and of the profound human need for connection in a world torn apart by war. It is a reminder that the war was fought not for abstract ideals alone, but for the specific, smiling faces of the people waiting back home. But what are the stories these photographs can't tell? How many of these relationships, sustained by idealized images and censored letters, fell apart under the strain of reality when the soldiers, often changed and traumatized by their experiences, finally came home? What was the unwritten story of the women who didn't wait, who started new lives and new relationships, a reality that the patriotic wartime culture refused to acknowledge? And for the soldiers who did not return, what happened to these cherished photographs, these last tangible connections to a life they would never live? Number 1, what did it all mean? Here is the last photograph. It's a simple one. A man in a uniform is walking up the front path to a small house. He is carrying a duffel bag. A woman has just run out the front door, her arms outstretched, a small child is clinging to her leg, looking at the approaching man with a mixture of shyness and wonder. The war is over and a soldier has come home. This is the moment that everything was for. The factory work, the rationing, the victory gardens, the war bonds, it was all for this. This quiet, personal reunion on a suburban street, this image is the bookend to all the others. It is the answer to the question of why a nation mobilized itself. The goal was not just to defeat an enemy, but to preserve a way of life, to bring the boys home, to allow families to be whole again. The return of the veterans was the final act of the home front's war. Communities prepared for their arrival with parades and welcome home signs. But the real homecoming was in these small private moments. The man in the photograph is one of millions. The process of demobilizing the largest military force in American history was a massive logistical undertaking called Operation Magic Carpet. From 1945 to 1946, ships and planes brought soldiers home from Europe and the Pacific in a steady stream. They returned to a country that was both the same and profoundly different from the one they had left. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic and military power. The war had ended the Great Depression and created a new level of prosperity for many. The returning veterans were given a path into this new America through the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill. This landmark piece of legislation provided veterans with money for college or vocational training, low-interest loans to buy homes or start businesses, and a year of unemployment benefits. As the historian Jennifer J. Keane has written, the GI Bill was one of the most transformative pieces of social legislation in American history. It democratized higher education, fueled a massive post-war housing boom, and helped create the modern American middle class. The family in the photograph is at the beginning of this new chapter. They will likely move into a new house in one of the burgeoning suburbs. The children will grow up in a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. The war will become a story, a collection of memories and photographs. But its legacy will be everywhere. The war fundamentally reshaped the nation's economy, its government, its social structures, and its place in the world. The experiences of the home front, the mobilization of industry, the entry of women into the workforce, the government's new role in managing the economy, the racial and social tensions that were both highlighted and suppressed, would continue to influence American life for decades to come. The photograph of the homecoming is an image of an ending, but it is also an image of a beginning. It represents the successful conclusion of a great national effort. The home front had done its job. It had armed the soldiers, fed the allies, and financed the victory. It had endured years of sacrifice and anxiety, and now its reward was in these quiet moments of reunion. The image is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of family and home. It is a reminder of what is worth fighting for. But what did this homecoming truly mean for the people in the photograph? What were the invisible wounds, the psychological scars of combat that the returning soldier brought home with him, and how would they affect this family for years to come? How would the woman, who had managed a household and perhaps a job on her own for years, adjust to a world that now expected her to step back into a more traditional domestic role? And how would the child, who may not even remember his father, learn to build a relationship with this man, who was both a stranger and a hero? The war was over, but for the family on the front porch, the journey was just beginning.